Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the high-stakes narrative of the Supreme Court of Kenya's 2025 docket. If you follow global legal landscapes at all, you already know that a nation's highest court doesn't just resolve everyday disputes, right? It literally writes the DNA of a country's future. So let's break down the mechanics of these truly monumental rulings.
To really appreciate what we're looking at today, we first have to establish the immense authority housed within these walls. We're about to explore how just a few strokes of the highest court's pen can shape absolutely everything in society. We are talking about a vast spectrum here. It ranges from deeply personal, intimate family ties, all the way up to massive, multi-million-dollar corporate mechanics, and even the very balance of power in the national government. The decisions made here ripple outwards, touching every single citizen.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the rights of the child. Second, the Senate versus the National Assembly. Third, the rule of debt. Fourth, taxing the banks. And finally, we'll wrap up with the court's lasting impact. All right, Chapter 1, Rights of the Child. This focuses on the case of FAF versus RFM and two others. At the center of this dispute is the estate of a Muslim man who had children with three different women. On one side, the appellant, who had a recognized Islamic marriage with the deceased, argued that under Islamic law, children born out of wedlock were considered illegitimate. Because of that, she argued they were entirely ineligible to inherit anything from their father's estate. Now, this argument directly pits a specific interpretation of religious law against broad constitutional rights. It essentially asks a massive question: does religious law supersede constitutional protections against discrimination?
While the Supreme Court stepped in with a very resounding answer. They ruled that the constitutional guarantees of equality and specifically the child's best interests fundamentally override the discrimination application of any law. They really emphasized that the Constitution is, without a doubt, the ultimate supreme law of the land.
To dig a bit deeper, the appellant had actually relied on Article 24(4) of the Constitution. That's a section which allows for some departure from equality guarantees when applying Muslim law. But the Supreme Court clarified that this is absolutely not a blanket exemption. It only applies in strictly necessary circumstances. They firmly stated that denying children benefits based on the alleged actions of their parents is unreasonable and unjustifiable. Basically, children cannot be punished for the circumstances of their birth. This ruling permanently alters inheritance precedents, ensuring that the law always has to be developed to favor fundamental freedoms.
Moving on to Chapter 2, Senate versus Assembly, the legislative maze.
Transitioning to the macro scale of national governance, we hit a classic separation of powers issue. Between 2018 and 2021, the National Assembly passed 23 acts of parliament entirely without the involvement or concurrence of the Senate. The Senate challenged this, arguing that these acts touched on county functions and therefore absolutely demanded their input. This led to a massive constitutional showdown. We are literally talking about questioning the validity of 24 laws. The entire dispute hinged on this single vital question: did the Speaker of the National Assembly unconstitutionally exclude the Senate? Or, to put it another way, did the National Assembly have the unilateral discretion to just bypass the Senate entirely if they firmly believed the bills in question didn't concern the counties? The lower courts were actually split on this, which made the Supreme Court's intervention absolutely crucial.
The Supreme Court neutrally broke down the constitutional mechanics to settle this. First, they clarified that the Constitution expressly excludes the Senate from participating in money bills. However, for all other bills, the court laid out a very strict operational framework under Article 110(3). It works like this. When a bill is introduced, the Speaker of that House must proactively notify the other Speaker and state their position on whether it concerns counties. If they agree, the bill proceeds smoothly. If they disagree, only then do they jointly resolve the question. The court emphasized that this isn't just about checking boxes. It's about fostering real legislative harmony and transparent cooperation between the two houses.
Okay, Chapter 3, the rule of debt. Let's look at the standard chartered case. Imagine a financial dispute that spans decades. Back in 1982, a debenture and legal charge were executed to secure a euro currency loan. Fast forward to 1986, and a fresh, localized loan is advanced. Decades later, the borrower argued that the lender couldn't enforce repayment or appoint receivers because they never registered fresh securities for that specific 1986 loan. So the big question is, does an old 1982 debenture legally cover a fresh 1986 loan without any new paperwork?
The court's answer relied heavily on the doctrine of continuing security. This is a hugely important concept in finance law. It basically means that once a charge or debenture is registered, it doesn't just evaporate when one loan is paid off or changed. It remains completely, fully operative until it's formally discharged through a specific statutory process, like registering a memorandum of satisfaction. Because the original 1982 securities were never formally discharged by the borrower, they automatically acted like a net, catching and securing that later 1986 localized loan. So why does this matter so much to the banking sector? Well, the court provided authoritative guidance that prevents total chaos in commercial lending. They ruled that new instruments are not strictly required for new advances if the old securities remain undischarged. Furthermore, they noted that a borrower's personal obligation to repay a loan is entirely distinct from the security itself. A borrower just cannot use a technicality regarding the security paperwork to walk away with both the loan money and the secured property. Doing so would amount to unjust enrichment.
That brings us to Chapter 4, Taxing the Banks, the ABSA Bank case.
Think about every single time you swipe a credit card. Behind the scenes, the Commissioner for Domestic Taxes demanded withholding tax from ABSA Bank based on payments the bank made to credit card companies like Visa and MasterCard, as well as interchange fees paid to other issuing banks. The commissioner claimed these were royalties and management fees, which are, of course, taxable. The banks strongly disagreed, so the Supreme Court had to step in and resolve this highly technical dispute that had massive financial implications for the entire banking industry. The Supreme Court came back with some precise, rapid-fire findings that completely overturned the Court of Appeal's previous stance. Anchoring their decision in Article 210(1) of the Constitution, they reiterated a golden rule. There can be no tax imposed without clear legislation. Looking closely at Sections 2 and 35 of the Income Tax Act, the court ruled definitively that payments to card companies are not royalties, and interchange fees are not management or professional fees. Therefore, they are just not liable to withholding tax under those specific classifications.
And finally, Chapter 5, the court's lasting impact, the scales of justice.
Reflecting on the sheer breadth of this docket, we have looked at 4 incredibly distinct rulings today. We saw the court protecting vulnerable children from discriminatory inheritance practices. We saw them balancing the immense power of Parliament to maintain legislative harmony. We watched them secure the foundations of corporate debt by clarifying continuing securities, and we saw them strictly define the limits of taxation on modern digital banking. In every single instance, they are acting as the ultimate calibrator, reinforcing the rule of law at every level of society. And that leaves us with a profound realization. The Constitution isn't just a static historical document. It's a living, breathing framework that has to be constantly applied to new, complex realities. Whether we're talking about modern family dynamics or global credit card networks, it adapts. As the highest court continues to interpret these laws, we have to ask ourselves, how will the continuous interpretation of the Constitution shape the future of the Republic? Because as we've seen today, the weight of these decisions rests directly on our everyday lives. Keep learning, keep questioning, and thank you for joining me on this explainer.